Okay, so I'm going to start off with bleeding hearts and hostas. Bleeding heart and hostas are fabulous, hardy plants. They are great for beginner gardeners to start with. On the left is the bleeding heart, and it has a beautiful pink flower. And on the right is several different varieties of hostas, and they are fabulous plants for shade gardens. Next slide, please. This is a bleeding heart. It's a long-lived deciduous plant. It loves shade and organic soil and moist soil. It has these beautiful clumping flowers. They all dangle off the stem, and they are kind of heart-shaped with a little drop coming out the bottom of it. And that's how they get their name for bleeding heart. They appear in early April. They emerge from the ground in early April, and they're blooming they are already producing flowers 3 to 4 weeks, and the blooms last 3 to 4 weeks, and they're really stunning in the garden. They can be reproduced either by division or seed. I've had several volunteers just sprout up in the yard, and I've just dug them up and moved them wherever I wanted, and they've done really well. You can divide them, but it's not really necessary. But if they're getting too large, you can, or if the center is dying, you can. Just when you do divide them, remember that their roots are very fragile, and so you need to take some care. And the best time to divide them is in the springtime, early in their growing season. Next slide, please. There are lots of different cultivars with different colored leaves and with different colored textures, and the flower color changes. On the left is a kind of a gold-leafed cultivar, and it has red flowers. In the center is a white flowered cultivar. The beautiful shape of the flower and how they're just hanging off of that stem. On the right are 2 different varieties. It's a thread leaf in the foreground, and that is a native plant. The natives only grow to about 12 inches tall, and they tend to bloom longer and last a little bit longer than the Asian variety, which are more common, and that's in the background there. If you refer to the photograph on the left, you'll notice that the leaf structure is compound, and each of those leaflets has deeply notched lobes. So it's a really distinctive plant. Let's see okay, next slide, please. Plant companions. So a drawback of the bleeding heart is that although they are long-lived, they don't last through the entire, from spring to fall. They start to senesce in the warm weather, and they don't look very good. So in the spring, they look quite stunning, but in later, they look kind of ragged and old and nasty. So you want to be able to hide this aging process. Hostas are a great selection, and on the left picture, there are some hostas just emerging from the ground. Those are maybe a week out, and it looks great against the bleeding heart in the background. Other options would be Stubby or any other kind of shade-loving plant that will grow the entire season. On the right, this is a picture from my garden. I have Virginia bluebells with the bleeding heart. And then in the foreground on the right is a allium. Alliums maybe aren't the best choice, but that's what I got going on there. So my plants emerge in April, and they go until mid to late July. But I kind of think my plants are in an ideal location. They're on the north side of the garden of a very shaded location. It's very cool. They only get morning sun, and it's in the ground, the soil is really a nice, rich soil. Next picture. Yes, the word of warning. Every part of the plant is toxic to animals and humans. Small dogs are particularly vulnerable to the plant if they eat it. And also can cause contact dermatitis. I haven't had a problem with it, but I don't play a lot in my bleeding hearts. I have a real problem with poison ivy. So when I read this, I thought, oh, I better be careful. So just a word of warning. Okay, next slide. Hostas. Hostas are gorgeous and they are so easy to grow, so easy to grow. If you make the right plant selection, they're just wonderful. Next slide. So they come in every color, it seems. They come in blue, they come in green, they come in yellow, they come in white, they come in variegated with white, variegated with yellow. There are just a lot of different options that you have. It's in the lily family, and there are so many options and they're so easy to deal with. So if you have a dark spot in the yard that you want to lighten up, you could put a yellow, you could put a white, you could put variegated, or anything. Let's say you have an area that is sunnier, you could pick a green one. If you have an area in dark shade, you pick a blue one. Each variety or each cultivar will be kind of specific to what its needs are. So just be aware of that when you're purchasing. Next slide, please. Where to plant. You know, hostas like bleeding hearts love shade or dappled sunlight, depending on the variety. They love organically rich soil. They love moist sites, but be sure not to have it wet because the tubers will rot. It's a good idea to mulch the site and it'll keep the moisture in there. Now, one of the things I did read, which these are the hostas emerging, and they said don't mulch the center of the plant. Obviously, I had already mulched, and so the center of the plant is already, it's coming out. So, but it would be really easy for me to move this plant if it got too big. If I need another plant someplace, if I have an empty spot, I will take a hosta and move it to where I want it. They can be divided with a shovel and dug up anytime. The best time is in the spring. If you do it anytime in the growing season, you will have to give it a little more TLC, making sure that it has enough moisture. Let's see, also the great part about hostas is at the end of the season, they give some really beautiful colors. I love the yellows that are kind of right down on the ground, and they just look stunning in the fall. They have a beautiful little subtle flower. It seems so understated because all of a sudden it's there. It can be, I've only seen it in kind of a light pale and a light pale purple and a white color. And I think they're really nice and bees seem to like them. Next slide. Problems for hostas. Deer. It's terrible. Deer love hostas. Everybody I know has had shaved hostas. Slugs can be a problem. Nematodes can be a problem. We're going to find out more about that. If the soil is wet, it'll be a problem. The tubers will rot. Anthracnose virus can be a problem. Bleeding heart problems, you can have leaf spot, botrytis nematodes, or powdery mildew. But overall, if you have good hygiene, you can limit these problems. So make sure you have the right selection, the right site selection, so that it's not too shady and it's nice and humusy soil, and you don't water it too much. Don't water overhead. That helps a lot by keeping a lot of those viruses and funguses at bay. And if you see any spots or fungus growing on there, just trim off the leaf or the stem and dispose of it, and you'll keep the problems under control. Next slide, please. I really enjoyed doing some of the research on this site. I found some interesting things I'd like to point out. In the Backyard Botany Bleeding Heart, it's a YouTube video put out by the New York Botanical Garden, and one of the gardeners there dissects a bleeding heart flower, and it was really pretty interesting. They're kind of beautiful, cut open and very complicated. And then a great source for dividing all perennials in your yard is dividing perennials, and it's put out by Clemson. And I thought that was really interesting information and can be useful too. Okay, so Scott, do we have any questions at all?
I do not see any at this time, but I have a question about the hostas. I've grown them as well, and you mentioned that the deer were a problem. What have you found works best to keep the deer away? Is it possible at all? I know it's like cocaine to them, but I don't know what we can do.
Well, I will say I have a dog, and the dog will let him out at night, and he kept them away for a while. But I noticed that I had some daffodils, and they were just like, I think a little fawn was out there napping while its mother was grazing. So I'm not sure dogs work that well. We've tried in the front, we've tried all kinds of deer repellents. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So I don't know. I just see deer graze on them, but they don't kill them. They just remove the beauty of them, and then you have a couple of stubs, but they do come back the following year, and they'll grow back depending on the time it's done also.
Sandra,
Yes.
I have sprayed the repellent that I found effective is invisible fence. And it smells bad. It's like kind of a urine smell, but that goes away after a little while. And I don't have a lot of deer. I have some, but I found that that's effective.
Okay, that's
house.
nice.
And if I could share one other thing about hostas, I wanted to divide some this fall, and I really messed up. You know, I cut it off, and it didn't look good. But I said, oh well, I'll stick it in the ground. If it lives, it lives. If it dies, it dies. And it lived. You know, so they're very hardy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I will say I'm not going to say I've never killed a bleeding heart or a hosta, but it was, you know, pretty extreme. I think they're great, hardy, easy to care for plants.
Right.
And they pack so much bang for their buck. You know, they're just the foliage is beautiful, the color is beautiful, so they're really nice plants.
Right.
I have a story about hostas. I dug some up from my grandmother's yard, and I put them in a bucket and brought them home, and I forgot about them. And a year later, I found them in my garage, and they literally had put out their leaves. So I just stuck them in the bucket that I had put them in out on the deck, and they lived. And I did that for like 3 or 4 years. I never watered them. I never fertilized them. And so a friend of mine said, those are beautiful. And I said, well, why don't you take them? Because obviously I haven't put them in the yard. She kept them in this bucket for like 10 years. And the things every year came back. They had no additional soil. So I was kind of convinced that they were the perfect plant. If you're one of those people that think, oh my God, I kill everything. I'm not sure you can kill these. So just anyway.
Sandra, I had a question about bleeding heart. You mentioned that spring was the best time to divide them. So I have a bleeding heart plant in my yard now. It's a little bit past peak. So is this the time, or should you divide them before they bloom? And how do you divide them? Do you just dig up the whole plant and then separate it, or cut it? Or how do you divide the bleeding heart? It's
going to be kind of clumpy. So you might have a big stand of them or something like that. And you'll see, you could do it in the fall too. So when you cut back this summer, just cut back so you could see it, or mark it somehow so you know which one you want to dig up and divide. And then dig it up and then kind of make a little incision and then pull it apart gently. So you'll see the eyes. You want to make sure that you have a couple eyes in each clump. But you could do it in the fall also.
But
just in this,
I could.
You can't. Just ideally, it's in the spring.
But is it now the time when it has already bloomed? Or should it be before it blooms? And if you do it in the spring?
Before, right as they're emerging.
Okay. Okay. So
Yeah, and you know, they're when they emerge, they're red, kind of a color. So.
okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So.
Thank you. No, thank you, Sandra. Appreciate it. Yeah, I was planning to talk about the tobacco rattle virus. Have a couple of slides, about 5 minutes of discussion. Basically, the tobacco rattle virus, it's referred to by the acronym TRV, and it can affect many herbaceous and vegetable plant species and/or varieties and cultivars. It was an education for me going through the research for this to realize how many plants that I might possibly have in my yard that could be affected by the tobacco rattle virus. The other tobacco rattle virus can affect the potatoes, and from a commercial point of view, that's probably the biggest impact that the tobacco rattle virus can have is on potato crops. And in potatoes, it's referred to as the corky ring spot. Stubby root nematodes are the primary means for spreading the virus. They're referred to as stubby root nematodes because as part of their feeding on the roots of the plants, they cause the roots to become stubby looking. So that's the reason for the term stubby root nematodes. Yvonne, if you go to the next slide. I've put together some examples of affected herbaceous plants, and you'll see that there are a wide variety of plants that almost are in everybody's, a couple of these at least are in everybody's garden, I'm sure. You know, the Stubby, the bleeding heart, Bluebells, daffodils, epimedium, gladiolas, hyacinths, iris, marigolds, narcissus, tulip, and vinca. And I was really surprised by the list here and how many of these I do have. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for the tobacco rattle virus on plants that I have around my house. They also have a significant effect on vegetable and some crop plants, barley, beans, beets, corn, peppers, spinach, potatoes, sunflower, and tobacco. But the one I mentioned before, the potatoes, the tobacco rattle virus could have a significant impact on potato crops. So that's something to keep an eye out for. I don't think, we had the discussion earlier before the talk today about growing potatoes. And I don't think the limited amount of potatoes that we would grow in our home gardens would be a reason to attract the nematodes and the tobacco rattle virus, but in a commercial application, it is a definite problem. Next slide, please. The identification of infected plants depends upon the plant that is impacted by the virus. It can range from mottling, with light and dark colored areas, yellow ring spots or line patterns, localized necrotic lesions, chlorotic spots, and leaves with notches. So you can see it's not one specific type of identification that you can make to determine if it's tobacco rattle virus, but this just gives you an idea of the variety of effects that it can have on the different plants. With the, I have on the next slide, please, thank you. The photo on the left is bleeding heart. You can see the yellow line work in the leaves there. That's an indication of the virus. And on the right, there's a potato. It was cut open. You can see that's the corky spot there, which is the corky ring spot. But on the outside of a potato, which I don't have a photograph of, it has the same characteristic type of ring around the potato, a portion of the potato, and you can tell it's infected by a ring in a light brown area on the skin of the tuber. Go to the next slide, please. It's spread primarily by the stubby root nematodes, and the nematodes don't intrude into the plant itself. They basically feed on the root hairs from the outside. And the root hairs, what happens is the nematodes withdraw the contents of the cells, and they create a problem with regard to the roots having the ability to uptake water and nutrients. So the nematodes then spread the virus to other plants. And the only benefit of the soils that we have here in Northern Virginia being clayey is that the nematodes don't travel that well in the clay. So it would limit potentially the spread of the virus in our gardens. The next slide, please. The nematodes, they're not easily, actually they can't be viewed by the unaided eye. The photo on the left shows the stubby root nematode, and the feeding tube is called out on the slide there. And what happens is you can see on the right photograph, the nematodes, that arc object on the photo, and the root hair is on the bottom part. And there's this small short piece that's shown as a white little piece that is the feeding tube. And that actually penetrates the wall of the root hair, and the nematode then withdraws the contents of the root cell. And that's what creates the problem with regard to being able to feed and produce or to allow the root cell or the root hair to pull material up into the plant. If you go to the next slide, please. How do you control the TRV? It's not really that practical to control it in a small garden area. Stubby root nematodes live rather deep in the soil, between 8 and 16 inches, so that it's difficult for a surface treatment to help to control the TRVs. Best way is to inspect the plants that you purchase to make sure that they're not affected. Use disease-free seeds. Try and grow disease-resistant cultivars, and that's particularly the case with potatoes, as some are less resistant, some are more resistant to the virus. And try and grow plants that are disease resistant, such as the annual phlox, the carnation, sweet william, and the zinnia. And be sure to clean your tools when you're pruning or dividing the plants. The references at the end of the talk should be reviewed to determine what types of appropriate chemicals can be used to clean the tools when you're doing your pruning or dividing of the plants. The last, next slide would be what do we do with the infected plants? Based on the COVID, we want to be sure that we sample a plant and then take it to the extension agent, follow all the requirements for collecting and delivering the samples to be sure that you have, in fact, the virus. Because the infected plants can't be treated per se, you know, as Sandra said, with regard to some problems with the leaves of hostas, you can just cut the leaf off. With viruses, the plants are systemically infected. So the infected plants therefore can't really be treated. So you have to remove them and dispose of them. The best way is through placing the infected plants into a bag and take them out to the curb for disposal at either landfill or a waste energy plant. So bottom line is to get them out of your garden areas. The last slide has some references that were used in the preparation of the talk today. So thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions there that came up?
There are a couple questions, Ernest. One is the potato that was cut open showing the infected potato. Do you discard the entire potato, or do you cut that out and is it still edible?
I would, I haven't seen a reference to that, but I would say that you'd be best to dispose of the entire potato.
Mm-hmm. And another question was, if you have an infected plant, should the root ball be removed as well as the part of the plant above ground?
Oh, definitely, yes. The entire plant, root ball and the plant above ground should be taken out and disposed of.
Okay. And the last question was, how do you find disease-free seeds?
You would have to go through a company that would, let me see. I would say you'd have to go through a pre-qualified seed company, as opposed to just having seeds basically provided by, a friend or somebody else. I don't know if anybody else that's on the call today would have any other thoughts, but I think if you go to a preferred seed vendor, they would be able to provide the seeds that would be acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think on some of the seed packets, they even list what, at least when I purchased tomatoes, what they're resistant to, what varieties are, what this variety is resistant to as far as fungus or other diseases. So maybe
Exactly.
that's it from the questions that we had through the chat.
Great, thank you.